Welcome back to the TrailBLAZER pod. I'm your host, Faye, and each week I bring you stories of Jewish women who are trailblazers. This week's guest, Deborah, moved 26 times and learned to thrive through every transition. From interior design to ADHD coach, she's all about helping people embrace growth, understand their strengths, and lead with courage. We dive into personal growth, Jewish observation, self-advocacy, and what it really means to create a life that fits you. Let's dive in. Deborah, welcome to the TrailBLAZER pod. How are you today?
I'm doing great, thank God. It's so good to be here.
So good to have you. I'm excited to get into it. We chatted briefly, but we didn't go into too many details because I like to organically learn about my guest. I like to start by asking everyone I have on about their early context, who they were as a little girl, what their family life was like, and somehow at the end it all ties back together. So I find that really interesting. So can you share your early context?
Yeah, I'm the oldest of three. My mom had all of us right in a row, so it was a busy household, brother and sister, and we moved so many times that I think of
Really?
my life in stages of which house we lived in to think back about our memories.
Wow.
And I counted, including moving in and out with all my possessions from early on until after college, 26 times.
Was there a specific reason for that?
Combinations of things. As my mom had more kids with my dad, we moved out different places, and then they got divorced, moved different places. Then my mom got remarried and got divorced, and
Wow.
then in and out different places in college, and then moved with my husband different places. So a lot of
That's so
moving, a lot of
fascinating.
change.
You don't hear that very often from people who are not from military families. That's a pretty unique childhood. Can I ask you, did you have a hard time with it or did you enjoy it? I know some kids who grow up that way really struggle because the change is scary, and then other kids thrive because it just teaches them about so many different places. So I'm curious what it was like for you.
It was hard,
Yeah.
especially since some of the changes were not to my liking, especially with the divorces and the one of the hardest ones was when I had to move in the first 6 months after junior high. So it was right in the middle of the first year when everybody had already changed
Mm,
schools, and then I had to
yeah.
acclimate into a completely new neighborhood with new friends, and
Wow.
it was hard. And I have trouble keeping in touch with people long term anyway. So with each of these moves, it's been a challenge.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I have not even close to what you did, but I grew up in Brooklyn, and then my last 2 years of high school, I moved to the Upper West Side, and then I went to college in California, and then I went to grad school in DC, and then I was in Miami, and now I'm back in New York, and I thrive off that, but it was not 26 times. But I also really struggle with keeping in contact with people who are not, next to me. Like I have a hard time with the texting and the calls and keeping up that kind of relationship versus if you're in my life, like physically, we'll hang out all the time. And it's something that I'm noticing now as an adult way more, of course, because I think I'm almost 30. So you start to realize how important those relationships are. But I think it's an interesting thing that happens when you move from place to place. That's really fascinating. I'm curious, like, would you say that's like a defining factor of who you are as a person, the fact that you moved around and had so much change?
I'd say it helped me to be flexible.
Mm-hmm.
It helped me to adapt in new situations. I never had really thought about it that way because to me it was, I mean, there was some consistency because I had grandparents that were in the picture, my mom's parents that were always there for us, and my mom. I've always felt grounded in a way.
Interesting.
Um, but it was like now I'm living in my house almost 16 years. This is the longest I've ever lived
Wow.
anywhere. Yeah.
Does
But
it
it,
feel good?
it feels really good.
Okay. I can imagine it's like in the beginning, it's a scary place to be when you're not used to that kind of stability. I'm putting quotes because there's, stability comes from different places. But I can, like, for me, like settling down was the scariest thing because I was so used to moving around and that excited me, you know?
Yeah, it wasn't scary for me in any way. It
That's amazing.
Because I think I've always felt like I was a grounded person,
Hmm.
no matter where I was, and I think that that really helps a lot.
Wow. That's really cool. So, did these moves affect how you were in school? There's different curriculums and there's different levels. And I'm just curious what you were like as a kid in school.
I think I was a good student. I was good with managing my time always. I don't think it affected me in any way with that. And when I want something, I am able to go after it and make headway, and I think that's really affected my trajectory with my path through my careers and so forth. Like even when we had made my mom had remarried again my stepfather, they moved down to Florida and I refused to go when I was 3 months away from my graduation in high school. So I ended up staying in a couple of houses, including my grandparents. And I found that even though I moved down there, I knew I wanted to move back up. I got myself back up to a college that I wanted to go to, and I was able to get things in place and get a part-time job and so forth. So I feel like I was able to be independent. And so the moves didn't affect anything in terms of my studies. I think it just made me feel like I can do things. I can
Wow.
achieve.
Were you always like that, or it's something that you learned along the way?
Well, I've always taught myself things. Like I'd go to the library and pick out a book on how to do sign language or how
Wow.
to type or whatever. So I guess it's always been just something innate that I can do things on my own, along with my family and everything. I'm not a loner, but it's just that I wasn't needy in terms of needing somebody else in order to make me feel like I can do things, which is such
Wow.
a blessing.
That really is such an important thing. How did Judaism play a role? And I'm asking this because you have an interesting journey, but I don't know what it was like for you as a kid.
Well, we celebrated Hanukkah
Mhm.
with our electric menorah in the window, my mom singing songs to us. I think when we were really little, we had a Pesach Seder, and I got together with grandparents for Rosh Hashanah. But other than that, we didn't do anything. But I did remember always thinking that I believed in God, and I remember when I was really little drawing a picture of this king in the sky with blonde hair and a crown.
Wow.
And I remember having talks with, like, these deep talks with kids that I'd sleep over with, about God, even though it wasn't really talked about in my life at
Yeah.
all. So there was a
Wow.
connection there, but it didn't really start happening in a concrete way until we started having kids and then realizing that we wanted to kind of dig in a little bit further into our Judaism. And my husband had
Wow.
basically nothing in his life related to Judaism, maybe a little bit of Hanukkah. That was it.
Wow. So I'm excited to talk about that, but let's put that aside for a
Sure.
second because I just want to. So you were moving around, you almost moved 3 months before graduating high school. What was your, I'm going to call it dream career, but what was your, trajectory looking like at that point?
So I knew I wanted to go into interior design. It's funny, I can't remember why at that point.
Okay.
Because like I knew when I wanted to do something, I was just going to do it. But I registered for college in Miami-Dade Community College, which was a commuter school, and I knew I started right then. And I liked interior design a lot. I love space. I get a lot of vibes about space, feelings about space. I'm very spatially oriented, and I think I'm a pretty creative person. I always like to draw, so I knew like that would be a nice way to combine my skills there. But funny enough, the earlier memory was when I was living at home, and I always shared a room with my sister for many, many years. But I would have my booth open like Lucy from Peanuts.
Oh.
And I would say, okay, my booth's open, so that way my sister could tell me all her troubles. So coaching was really
Yeah.
like the very beginning part of what I wanted to do, I guess.
Wow.
And I always loved the interaction with people.
Hmm.
So after I went to a year for that community school, I just like, I was in Florida. I didn't want to be there anymore. And I said, that's it. And I said, I'm moving back to New York. And my whole family was down there at that point. And I looked at different locations and found this great school in Old Westbury, New York Institute of Technology. And I got everything all together with student loans and grants and got all the applications set and just
Wow.
at 19 made my way back up to New York.
Wow.
Started
That
design school. Yeah.
that's amazing. It's like everything you're saying so far, you sound like such a self-starter kind of a person and like a self-learner. And it's amazing because I think so many of us have to really actively make the decision to become that way. And it's so cool that you were like that from a young age. I'm curious, like, was your family like fostering that kind of environment for you? Or they were kind of like, okay, we know this is Deborah, we'll just let her do her own thing.
Well, my mom has always been a go-getter.
Okay.
She still is, thank God. She's turning
Good
87 in
example.
2 days,
Wow.
and
Wow.
she's just, needs to be done. Like when she'd gotten divorces, she knew that she had to pack
Yeah.
us all up and move and
Wow.
whatever, and very strong influence. Grandparents too. They were always a very strong influence. And my brother and sister and I are very different from each other, but similar. My brother passed away about 20 years ago.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Thank you. But we always did, what we needed to do. So I guess it kind of runs in the family.
It's like sounds like there's very little fear of change, like sometimes people are afraid of ending things because it seems like failure. and it's actually just the start of something new usually, right? Like one door closes, another door opens. As I speak to women like you on the podcast, I'm just so amazed by the pivots that people take and the bravery they have to recognize that something is no longer right for them. And it's really helping me. Honestly, it gives me a lot of strength and like the ability to see a little bit more bigger picture in my life to figure out like when something is not right anymore. So I really appreciate you sharing that, and we're going to talk about that because I'm very curious about it. You made several pivots in your career, right? Now that I know you moved so much, it makes a little bit more sense how you had that, like, okay, we got to go, right? But I'm curious. So you were doing interior design, then you went into professional organizing, right? And then you went into ADHD coaching, which is what you're doing right now.
Correct.
How did you know that it was the right time to make those changes?
Well, there were some natural breaks because I was working in Manhattan for an interior design firm for a number of years. And then my husband and I decided to move to London. And they actually had a
Wow.
branch there. And I said, moving to London, can I work there? Instead of the other
Yeah.
way around.
Yeah.
Just wanted to make that change.
Yeah.
And my husband was working as a foreign exchange trader, so he could really work anywhere in the world. So we moved there. And then I actually became pregnant with my first son. I have four kids when we were there. And we decided to move back to the States for a number of different reasons. So at that point, I didn't work in interior design anymore for
Okay.
a while, but just, kind of dabbled along the way when I needed to help an organization out or a shul or, whoever
Yeah.
needed it. And then I was really kind of being more of a stay-home mom for all throughout my kids' childhood, which is such a rarity now. But I
Yeah.
loved it.
Yeah.
And then we decided that we needed to move for financial reasons. And at that point, I was starting to learn more about the organizing profession, and I had heard somebody speak at our shul about it, and something about it really clicked for me because I love creating order. There's something about it, and that's what I loved about with spatial design,
Right.
because I worked on big floor plans for a corporate office
Wow.
design firm, and just creating something beautiful out of
A
whatever,
mess.
yeah,
Chaos.
chaos or space that there's nothing in there
Yeah.
already. And I decided that I would like to start my own company. So I said, if I can get myself organized with four little kids, I can organize anybody. And I
100%.
and I started to do it for other people besides myself, and started to read books and lectures. And I became a professional organizer in 2010, and started to go to meetings with NAPO, which is the National Association of Productivity and Organizing Professionals. And it was wonderful. It was really wonderful. And I started working with amazing clients. And what I noticed along the way was, well, I saw a booth set up at one of the expos during a conference about coach training. And I'm like, oh, I want to do that. Like, it resonated
Wow.
immediately with me. So,
Wow.
when you're talking about transitions, God put it right in front of me a number of times where I needed it, when I needed it, because the things that I get passionate about and change are the things that come from my heart, that I want. The things that are difficult are when it's not in my control, like moving or when a
Right.
divorce happens and stuff. But this is great because the training was all about, going deeper with your clients. And as you saw from the Peanuts booth opening, like that was
They
something
had
that
it in
really
you.
resonated. So started that training, and I realized along the way that this was going to be what I wanted to segue into at some point.
So it sounds like almost they sometimes it's scary when something isn't working out, but you're not sure what the next move is, right? For you, it sounds like it was such a natural development into the next thing you were doing, from like organizing to interior design. On paper it sounds so different, but the way you're explaining it, it's pretty similar, like the way the brain has worked. And then coaching is what you were doing with organizing with your clients, but just much deeper than what you
In
were
their
ever
brain,
doing. So like it
helping them
evolved.
work.
Exactly. That's really cool. So can you talk to me a little bit about your work now?
Yeah. So once I segued into fully coaching, I realized that the population that I most like to work with were people with ADHD and executive function challenges, because most of my clientele, whether they were diagnosed or not, had that going on for them. I realized that it was so important for their life to be the way that fit their brains and the way they were thinking. And especially the environment, the way that the systems are set up, the way that they would use their time. So it was just kind of more of a natural segue then also to work specifically with adults. I don't work with kids.
Okay.
Adults with ADHD and executive function challenges. So I absolutely love what I do, and I work with a whole range of people, mostly women, some men, mostly in their late 20s and higher.
Okay.
People who have been diagnosed all their lives, or just had a diagnosis, or don't have a diagnosis, and
Yeah.
come to me with just, all about challenges with any executive function, or all of them: time management, organization, focus challenges, impulsivity, emotion. It's a lot about emotional dysregulation. So, being able to be flexible in the moment, the task initiation, being able to follow through, all these I'm listing are
Yeah.
all these executive functions. So I work with them usually on a weekly basis on our calls, and we go through together and kind of like unknot all the busyness in the brain
Yeah.
and help them to see how to make their days less overwhelming, and make them feel more proactive instead of reactive all the time,
Wow.
and how to learn how to pause before they make rash decisions. A lot goes into all this work because there might be a number of things that they're challenged with at the same time.
Was there something that you noticed when you started working with clients who have ADHD that you like never expected?
How much self-negative talk there is.
Really? Is it because they're like misunderstood or society is like what do you think it is from?
It's both. If they never had a diagnosis, or even if they did when they were little, we're talking about many years ago for some of these people,
Yeah.
they had been looked at by family members who didn't understand, a lot of them, as being lazy, as being, not trying hard enough, as not being like everybody else, where in fact, most of the time they're trying 3 or 4 times harder to just try and do
Right.
everything in a way. So even if they were treated well by their family, the self-talk about how bad they are and how they can't face things, they do things the same way as anybody else and all that, it was just so detrimental to them, and they're not being able to trust themselves and be able to feel like they can improve. And then you get all the other talk from external, whether it was a spouse or a family member
Yeah.
or a colleague or a boss. What I found one time, I had said this to a client when she was telling me different things. I said, you're not broken. And she just stopped, and just her reaction was just like priceless. Like, she started to laugh. She was like,
Wow.
she'd never heard that before. Like, she always felt like she was broken. And
Wow.
I think that was what had made me so surprised at first. And but then I see it's a pretty regular pattern.
Do you find that diagnosing helps them move on? Because I feel like sometimes when you don't know what's going on with you, you just feel like nothing you're doing is working because you've been taught how to do it for people who don't have ADHD, right? And the brains are different. And sometimes when you say, okay, it's ADHD, it's not you, you're not broken, your brain is wired differently, that can help. I'm just wondering if you've experienced that.
I think for most people, when they get some type of diagnosis, they feel a sense of relief,
Yeah.
or like, oh, that's why. But I've had clients also that say, I don't want to get a diagnosis because I don't want a label.
Mm, that's a hard balance.
Yeah. And,
Mm.
I'm not there to diagnose them, and I'm not there to push them in any direction. I'm just there to help them to see themselves better and to see how to make their life fit better. You know,
Yeah. I find this topic really fascinating. So thank you for the work that you're doing. I think it's
oh,
so important.
I'm so glad to be able to do this.
It's amazing that you're so passionate about it. I want to ask you for if you can give advice to people who are listening that are at that cusp of making a change in their life but are scared. What would you tell them?
I'd say, take a look at what is it that they're fearful of,
Mhm.
and what is it that they really want to do, and maybe try to project, like, what would they feel like if they were able to overcome any of these obstacles and see themselves on that other side, and how life could be different for them. I think that's a powerful tool when you can kind of telescope across
Yeah.
and be aware of what might come up, so that way you can then address the different things. That happens a lot when client and I are ending our call, and we're talking about actions they can take
Mhm.
to facilitate anything that we were talking about. Many times I'll say to them, well, what might come up that we'd have to address? Because something can always come up, and you don't
Yeah.
want it to be something that stops you from doing something. So being able to be realistic and all right, first of all, picturing yourself and what it would be like and feel like, but then saying, okay, well, this might come up, so I need to support myself in this way, and I might need to have a body double, like somebody that is doing something at the same time while you're doing something, or I might need an accountability partner or whatever. So I'd say looking at both, projecting forward, and then also seeing what might happen so that you can address it.
This I like this because you pinpointed exactly what I struggle with ending things. It's because I always I've always had this. I always think like 15 steps ahead and like what can go wrong and this can go wrong and that can go wrong and what would I do here and sometimes it's so overwhelming that it's just safer to stay where you are, right? And so like what advice would you give me or anyone that like has the same way of thinking to be able to just take it's almost like a leap of faith because at the end for people who like the people you're talking about they need to be able to start thinking about those things but for people who naturally go there and it becomes like a right you ruminate on everything that can go wrong or anything that might not work the way you want to it comes down to a leap of faith at the end of the day. So, what advice would you have for that?
Well, I'd say one thing you could do is to take a look at some big change you made before that you were fearful of and see what happened along the way that you had to address and how did you overcome it so you could see what innate strengths that you have that will help you deal
Interesting.
with it. Another is depending on how you like to solve problems, like I'm a verbalizer, so I will want to talk to my husband, my my colleague, my daughter, or anybody, my
Yeah.
mom, to figure out problems because then it doesn't feel like you're so all alone.
Interesting.
And then just facing it, like actually whether it's talking or writing or whatever, like jot things down and get them to be out of here so that it becomes something concrete to
Right.
address.
Right. And it's not just floating around the brain.
No, yeah,
Yeah.
because there's so
That's
much that that can happen when we're in that space.
exactly. Exactly. Speaking of pivots, let's pivot a little bit back to your journey with Judaism. So, you and your husband both had your unique journeys with Judaism, and I want to talk to you about how you navigated that individually and as a couple because I think it's one thing to go through such a life change by yourself and it's another to go through it with a partner and then stay together and be able to right like it's very rare for that kind of story to have a happy ending in terms of the relationship I feel like. So let's start from the beginning. When you and your husband met, where were you Judaism wise or observance wise?
So I met him the first week in college.
Wow.
I knew right away that he was for me.
Oh my gosh. What?
It took him a year, but I just knew instantly.
Wow.
Um, it wasn't like I was observing anything at that point. But what ended up happening is that when we had our second child, we had first a boy. We had a bris for him. I knew that much, to have a
Okay.
bris. And then we had our second child. We were living in New Jersey. I grew up in Queens. We were living in New York at that time. We both at the same time said to the mohel we found through that's a whole other story. Um, that we wanted to learn more about Judaism, and he
Wow.
told us about this rabbi, Rabbi Vishnevsky in Lakewood, New Jersey, who does all this outreach, and that we could speak with him. And we started on our journey together, taking classes. And what ended up happening was that my husband, who is a very like straight person, he's very honesty and black and white in terms of truth. He saw right away, this is it. And
Mm,
he wanted to jump into a lot of things where me, I like to kind of do it at my own pace. And it was a struggle at first, but the rabbi and the rebbitzin were wonderful because they said to him, "You do your thing, let
wow.
her come along the way, and don't rush anything because you can't run up a mountain." And it was it took a while for me to get on board, and I
Hmm.
started to then keep Shabbos and keep kosher because it affected me much more with relationships and the home where
Right.
it's a different dynamic, and we have a very wonderful relationship, my husband and I, thank God. So we nurtured and supported each other, and it was hard with family. I mean, family thought we were absolutely nuts. His family was more local, mine were in Florida, but we tried to do everything with love and show everybody we love them no matter how observant we were
Yeah.
getting, and even though we couldn't eat their food,
Wow.
whatever. And it was a real journey for us, and we've been Balchubas for over 30 years now.
It's amazing. You were mentioning like you had the bris for your son, you both said we want to learn more. Was this a conversation you had before or just came
No,
up?
it just like
Really?
we we both said the same time. Yeah, yeah,
Oh my gosh. And then after that, did you have a conversation like, wow, can't believe we both said that at the same. I'm just like
yeah. We retell
that's
that
almost
story.
comedic.
I know.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh. Wow.
yeah.
So I want to ask you if it's okay. Like, don't know anything what that journey is like. So I'm curious, like, what were some of the things that I don't know if it struggled, I'll let you use your own words, but took a little bit longer for you to accept. And I want to talk a little bit more about like being a woman part, because you mentioned that I think it's a really fascinating thing. Whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Sure. I think the last thing that I was able to take on was more about my attire and changing to just dresses and so forth. But by that time, it was fully Shomer Shabbos and everything except that. There was something about it. I just don't know. I guess I'm a much more casual dresser, and I thought, like, how can I changed into that. But we
Yeah.
ended up owning a different part of the journey. We ended up owning a kosher Italian restaurant where we live in in New Jersey.
Look at
And
you.
yeah, my husband went from foreign exchange trading to saying, "Let's open up a pizza shop." We thought he'd spend more time with the kids, and it turns
Okay.
out it was going to be way more time than it was going to be in the journey. But the
Wow.
reason why I'm telling you that is because I knew on the inside how I felt, but what I
Hmm.
projected on the outside was not who I was on the inside in terms of if I
Interesting.
come across other observant people, they didn't know I was observant too. And I noticed that like I just wasn't feeling like it was matching. And I felt now that I was representing a kosher restaurant to anybody who's, completely observant Orthodox, that I wanted it to match. It made more sense for me to match at that time. And so that was the biggest last change.
Wow.
Yeah.
Think it's like when you I was a little kid, like when you hear of about tshuva, you don't even think about the stages and how it's not all at once. People don't realize that when you convert or you become a Baal Tshuva, it's not like it happens overnight. Like suddenly I'm choosing this path, and so I'm keeping Shabbos, I'm keeping kosher, I'm wearing skirts, I'm covering my hair, and I'm going to the mikvah. Like there's so many different levels and so many different things that people are comfortable with, and it's like shedding layers of your past and putting on new layers, and it's so nuanced. And I think it's so interesting. Like, I can't imagine, I'll ask you what that was like, the space where you don't feel anymore like you belong to the non-observant community, right? Because you're connected internally, but you're not fully externally with the observant community or the Orthodox community yet. It seems like it's almost like this black hole. What did that feel like?
For me, it was a little bit different. I feel like all the parts of me are still here.
Okay, I like that.
It's almost like when think about age too. I'm still the 12-year-old inside. I'm the 20-year-old.. I'm the 30-year-old.
Mm,
So I have my background loving 70s music and Motown, and I love art, and I love this, and I love that, and I live in a mixed community of Jewish, non-Jewish, observant, non-observant. I work with Jewish, non-Jewish, observant, non-Jewish,
yeah,
in all capacities. So my growth as a Balchuva is more about me being centered with having my spirituality guide my moral principles and how I live in the world. It's not that it's something was cut out.
got it.
Like
That's
I've
beautiful.
grown. Yeah, I've grown and expanded. Still have my
That
struggles
Yeah,
with
that
stuff,
sounds
but
way healthier, to be honest. That sounds like
yeah.
beautiful. And it's just because that's really life. It's like you can't close off a chapter in your life. It's always going to be there, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
That's really beautiful. I
Make it
appreciate you
work.
sharing. When we talked, you mentioned something really fascinating, that when you did become religious, you started having different kinds of interactions with clients and things like boundaries with male clients. And I told you, don't tell me more because I want to ask you about this on the podcast. So I really don't know much about what you're referring to, but I think this is an interesting topic. So can you share like when you notice certain things and how you address them, things that maybe you were more comfortable with before, or you weren't?
Well, it actually is funny because when I was an organizer, I'd had some male clients,
Hmm.
before I started coaching. So I was in person. So, I was not shaking hands, once I started becoming a certain level of observancy. And I had to make a decision in the moment whether it'd be really awkward or not for the other person, or if I could, say something. I had to do it on a kind of case by case decision-making process. When I started to work on Zoom, it's different. I don't have to worry about
Right.
that. But what was coming up with the coaching is that this happened a couple of times where I would send an intake form to them to fill out, and they would put something in there that I did not feel comfortable addressing. Maybe, I mean, for one person, it was an addiction to pornography,
Mm, okay.
which I'm like, all right, what do I do with this now?
Right.
I know I'm going to go over the intake form, and I'm going to everything else about the person, there was no red flags,
Mm-hmm.
but when I got to that point, I said, I just want you to know this is not something that I can address in our sessions. This is something that if you feel that you would need to, we need to change. It would be a different coach that you'd work with. But I appreciate you sharing that. I just want to let you know so you can make a decision and so forth.
Wow.
And we were able to coach for a bit, for a number of sessions, and nothing came up ever about that. That was like an extreme example, but
Yeah. Wow. Interesting.
I had to really hold my boundaries without making this person feel degraded in any way, and it had nothing to
Yeah.
do with my judgment about him. I mean, I've dealt with people who are addicted to drugs or addicted to, all different things, but I knew that there was some things that I can discuss more freely,
Yeah.
and you know, or that I would be okay. And, like there are other times where if, let's say, somebody wanted to talk about dating as a male, I knew that that wasn't something that would be within my parameters. If it was a woman, it would be different
Right.
because it's not that that comes up that often with my coaching with them, but, they want to make room for that in their life and so forth. So I learned that I have to be very clear about my boundary setting, but do it in a kind, compassionate way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. It's real. That's real life, right? That's like really moral and ethical things that you have to really sit with yourself and think about what feels right to you, like really deep down. But I think the important part you're saying there is that there's always a respectful way of doing that, and it sounds like you've always been that person. You were mentioning like when I became observant, like there was no shedding my previous life and my family and all of that stuff. And I think it's a really fine balance with that. Can you give people advice for, it doesn't have to be in a religious aspect, but for you, it sounds like it was people who are struggling with like their values in general and their work and balancing the two. Like, how can somebody sit with themselves and do that hard work and figure out what feels right to them and then take actions in a kind way?
This actually comes up quite often with my client work.
Oh,
We
really?
because we talk about communications and advocating.
Mm-hmm.
Learning what is it like if you could say anything to that person like right now to make them understand you better, or that would address your needs, what would it be? So that can take the form of, let's say, someone's at work and they need a weekly meeting with very clear cut bullet point
Yeah.
checklist and timelines and so forth that they never get. If they need people to give them more time before they make a decision, say that I just need to allow myself some time to think about it. Or if they're working with sometimes I talk with about relationships with people.
Yeah.
That comes up a lot. How to advocate. And I once learned a nice little formula that advocating is about, it's self-disclosure, and then being able to give a little educational piece, like
Mm.
what is it about how their brain works or how they work that it's that they need something to ask in
Yeah.
order for them to be able to be more productive, or
Wow.
so I think learning how to understand what you need, what would make things be right or helpful, and then learning how to communicate it and then the right time so that people receive it is a big part of it.
Yeah. It's a huge part of why I have this podcast so that people can hear stuff like that because I know I can't speak for men, but I know for a lot of women, we have for so long not been allowed a seat at the table or allowed in the room and then we're finally being given that and it's like I'll just take myself for example. It's like how can I now like risk that with any sort of, tension or me speaking up for myself? Like I don't want to risk any of that because I was finally given this opportunity and I know so many people my age struggle with that because they are finally sitting at the table and it's like what I'm now going to jeopardize that and it's we're not taught to be able to advocate for ourselves in a so a lot of people advocate them for themselves in ways that are not necessarily going to benefit them, right? Because we're not given the skills and then it backfires. We're not taught this in school. We're not taught this in college. We're not taught this in grad school at all. Like these are all the stuff that it's the same as like taxes. Nobody taught me how to do taxes, and I have to figure it out for myself. So I really hope that people like you and other people are able to share stuff like this for young women so that we can kind of like use this as like a mentorship opportunity and not feel so scared, like being able to say what we need and what we want, right?
Yeah. And while you were talking, it made me think about the other side of the coin too, is establishing what is a healthy boundary. Because
Mm-hmm.
once you realize what you need, then it's a matter of saying, okay, this is kind of like my non-negotiable.
Right.
I was working with a client who, what she loved about her job was that she was working one-on-one. She was working for like an outreach organization, Jewish outreach. And it ended up being that she was getting a lot of jobs in that had to do with like event planning, which drained her because she's not a really social person to begin with, except for
Yeah, yeah.
one-on-one.
Yeah.
So when something new came in that somebody asked her, can you teach 7 courses of this? And she didn't want to do that type of work. She was able to pause after we worked together a bit. She did put a lot of work into it to make to
Yeah.
get to this point and say, I can actually do 1 or 2 if you'd like, because then I have the ability to kind of really,
Yeah.
give something important to these people. And she didn't just outright say no. She thought about it. She
That's so
knew,
smart.
yeah, it was so transformational for her because she realized it's not all black and white. You can figure out, you could just say no also, and say, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be able to give my all to this at this time. Maybe at another time or with different
Right.
format or whatever, learning how to
Yeah.
like kind of, you saying something yes to something, you're saying no to something else. So
Right.
it's keeping those healthy boundaries.
I love that you just said that because then it gives the other person the opportunity to kind of understand the way your brain is working as opposed to feeling like you're just shutting down an opportunity, which doesn't always look great. It's like, why are you saying no to this amazing opportunity? But when you frame it like that, when it's coming from a genuine place, it's like, oh, you actually care so much. You want to be able to give it your all. And if you're giving me 7 tasks, I can't give it my all, right? And I'm actually in a similar space where I'm learning how to say no to things because again, it goes back to being given opportunities and feeling so almost so grateful for opportunities that you're like, how dare I say no to things? And feeling guilty for saying no to things. That's something I struggled with. And also being like, if I say no to this, is this opportunity ever going to come up again? Am I basically screwing up my chances, right? And even though I had no bandwidth, like I would take things on with zero bandwidth. So love that advice. That's so smart. That's real actionable advice to think about the reasoning behind, not just the yes or the no. That's really smart. Thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So now that we've talked and you've had so many different, let's call it chapters, I'm curious what success looked to you like as, let's take that like first week in college when you met your now husband versus what success looks like to you now.
Well, success then was just, my life was right all, this big open
Mm,
ahead of me with, knowing what I wanted to do in the next moment. But, when I think about people being successful now, like to me, I've got, thank God, a beautiful marriage, a beautiful family. They're such great kids and
oh,
grandkids, and my other family and friends. Like, it's being able to have, um, feeling like I'm making the right decisions or trying to. I'm not perfect by any means, but like
no one is.
just
Yeah.
right, but just trying to set myself up with people who
Yeah.
are inspiring and having gratitude.
Yeah.
That makes me feel like that's success, is being able to be grateful no matter what comes up.
Oh, that's beautiful. So, Deborah, I'm going to ask you the question that I ask all my guests at the end, and that is, what does being a trailblazer mean to you?
Well, it actually, I was thinking about a word you said before about being vulnerable,
Mm,
but like Brene Brown says, it also
mm,
means courage, right? You have
I
to
love
have
her.
courage, and vulnerable doesn't need to be a negative word.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, because you have to be able, to take a chance on yourself, like to listen to yourself and take that chance. And I feel like we're trailblazers for our kids with our Judaism, because now they
Mm,
have the full spectrum to live their
yeah.
lives, and just to be able to just trust yourself and move forward.
Yeah. I would say you're definitely a trailblazer in terms of that. You really went from having one life path, in terms of, connection, spirituality, Judaism, observance, and you and your husband both just pivot. And it sounds like you really went into this world where it's like, I don't know what this is going to turn out. And that's so brave and so beautiful. And look at you now. So thank you so much for coming on here and sharing your story.
It was a
Thank you,
real
Deb.
pleasure being here.
Thank you.